I never thought that such a small act could smell like victory. The mahogany-paneled conference room smelled faintly of old paper and Charles's cologne, a warm cedar scent I hadn't smelled since the night he left me his wool cardigan on the porch swing. I sat at the long polished table, fingers intertwined so tightly my knuckles ached, my wedding band pressing into my skin like a reminder. Across from me, Elise lounged in her tailored cream silk blouse, her nails tapping an impatient rhythm against the armrest, each click a little dagger. Her hair, scraped into that perfect bun, made her look every inch the poised heiress she imagined herself to be. And that smile, oh, that smug little crescent she'd worn 2 weeks earlier when she told me, over a cooling cup of chamomile tea, that I shouldn't expect a dime from my late husband's estate. She had floated into this meeting as if it were her coronation, whispering to her brother, exchanging conspiratorial glances, giggling like a schoolgirl in a brand new dress. My cardigan felt heavy on my shoulders despite the warmth of the room, as if carrying all the years Charles and I had built this life together. The attorney's voice droned through legal clauses I barely heard until his tone shifted. His eyes, sharp as glass, flickered to Elise. Clause 17, he read slowly, savoring each word. In the event my spouse survives me, she shall inherit. He paused. I swear the silence hummed, the ticking clock behind him suddenly too loud. The primary residence, the vineyard property in Sonoma, and full controlling shares of Parker Family Holdings. The air seemed to thicken. I could almost taste the metallic edge of Elisa's disbelief. Her legs started bouncing under the table, the way it did when she was 8 and caught lying about breaking the porcelain vase in the sunroom. My breath caught, not just at the inheritance, but at the vineyard. I had no idea Charles even owned a vineyard. That meant he'd hidden something, but for whose protection? And then the attorney smiled, just slightly, and I knew. This wasn't the end of the battle. It was the first move. Some truths land softly, like petals. Others drop like stones in a still pond. The attorney's words still hung in the air like the lingering scent of strong coffee, bitter and undeniable. I could feel the grain of the table beneath my fingertips as I smoothed the edge of my late husband's cardigan draped over my lap, an old habit when I needed to keep my temper steady. Elisa's jaw didn't just drop, it seemed to tremble, as if her carefully arranged mask had cracked. I kept my eyes on her, noticing how her lipstick, perfectly applied in the morning, now bled slightly into the corners, a faint smudge against her porcelain smile. She swallowed hard, the motion sharp against the pearl necklace she always wore when she wanted to look powerful. The room itself seemed to change temperature. The sunlight streaming through the high windows felt too bright, dust motes swirling in the beams like tiny witnesses to her shock. The air smelled faintly of the attorney's aftershave, clean, citrusy, sharp. Elisa's right foot began tapping, faster now, a small percussion of panic beneath the table. But it was the vineyard that caught in my mind, sweet and surprising. I could almost taste the imagined ripeness of grapes on a late summer afternoon, the way Charles once described wine, still warm from the sun. He had never taken me there, never even mentioned it. Which meant he'd been keeping something in reserve, for me. I glanced at the attorney. He met my gaze briefly before returning to his notes, but there was something in the tilt of his mouth, a private knowledge. Elise caught it too, and her nostrils flared. She knew there was more. And in that moment, so did I. People think betrayal starts with a single blow. It doesn't. It starts in whispers. I first met Charles 40 years ago, when the smell of disinfectant still clung to my scrubs and my shoes squeaked on hospital floors. He was a law student then, surviving on instant coffee and optimism. I remember the feel of his hand, warm, calloused from summer construction jobs, when he first shook mine. We built everything together from there, the business, the home with the creaking porch swing, the life that seemed untouchable. Elise was our firstborn, arriving on a spring morning when the lilacs were in bloom, their perfume flooding the open window of my hospital room. She was brilliant, yes, with that quicksilver mind that impressed teachers and terrified babysitters. But even as a child, she collected favors like seashells, expecting them to pile into a throne. Charles used to say she was born negotiating. I used to think it was charming. Years later, when Charles's health began to fade, Elise arrived with a leather planner tucked under her arm, offering to organize his finances. She'd sit at the kitchen table, steam from her peppermint tea fogging her reading glasses, tapping her pen against the page while Charles patiently answered her questions. I thought she was helping. I didn't know that in the quiet moments, after I'd gone to make soup or fold laundry, she was calling relatives, telling them I was more concerned about bank accounts than about her father's care. That she was painting me as a gold digger in my own home, where every piece of furniture had a memory, every chipped mug had been bought together. It wasn't one big knife in the back, it was the slow erosion, the daily scratches. By the time I realized, the portrait she'd drawn of me had already been framed and hung in other people's minds. Sometimes the smallest line of ink can feel like a fortress wall. I sat there in that over-polished conference room, the air heavy with the faint tang of lemon polish and the musk of too many wool suits. My fingers, almost without thinking, traced the worn edge of Charles's cardigan over my lap, each loop of yarn soft from years of washing. It was the same cardigan he used to pull around my shoulders during late-night vineyard trips, back when the business was young and we still believed hard work could shield us from everything. Hearing the attorney's words again in my mind, primary residence, vineyard, full controlling shares, I felt something unfamiliar rise in my chest. Not quite victory, not quite relief. It was closer to being seen. Because maybe, just maybe, this wasn't just about property. Perhaps Charles had known what I hadn't been willing to admit, that Elise's charm was a performance with an audience, and her kindness, when shown to me, was a costume she wore for his sake. He must have seen the sideways glances, the way she leaned too close when reading over his documents, her pen tapping in a rhythm that said she was counting down to something. The sunlight caught on the crystal water pitcher in the middle of the table, scattering rainbows across the papers. Elise shifted in her seat, her perfume, something sharp and expensive, mixing with the faint aroma of my own lavender hand cream. She looked like someone who had just watched the first domino tip, realizing it wasn't falling the way she'd planned. I let my gaze rest on her without a word. It wasn't gloating. I've never been one for public scenes. But in that silence, I imagined Charles's quiet satisfaction, his sly smile when he managed to win a chess game neither of us thought he was paying attention to. If this clause was his move, then I was now holding the piece he'd left for me to play. And I could almost hear him saying, in that patient voice of his, "Don't rush. Let her make the next mistake." I folded my hands over the cardigan in my lap, smoothing its edge as if I could iron away the years of frayed trust. The meeting moved on, the attorney droning about percentages and shares, but all I could feel was the shifting ground beneath Elise's feet. Because if Charles had left me this much, I had to wonder, what else had he left that she didn't know about? And the way the attorney kept glancing at me, I suspected I wouldn't have to wonder for long. Trouble rarely knocks on the door. It slips a note into your hand when no one is looking. When the meeting finally wound down, the attorney gathered the scattered pages with careful precision, the rustle of thick paper echoing in the high-ceilinged room. I was already standing, smoothing the cardigan over my arm, when he reached for his briefcase. His movements were deliberate, almost too deliberate, like a man performing a task while waiting for the right cue. Then, just as Elise swept past him in a waft of her crisp, citrus perfume, he turned slightly toward me and, without a word, slipped a small folded paper into my hand. His fingertips were cool against my palm, the gesture so quick and practiced it might have been mistaken for him returning a pen. I felt my stomach tighten, my fingers closing instinctively around the paper as though it might dissolve if I let go. I didn't look down, couldn't, because Elise was still in the room, lingering by the door as if she expected applause for her exit. Her heels clicked sharply against the marble floor, each step sounding like punctuation to a private speech she was giving herself. When she finally left, her voice still trailing complaints to my son, the room seemed to exhale. I opened my palm under the table. Just 3 neat words, written in an old-fashioned, slanted hand. There's something you should see. Call me tonight. The black ink stood stark against the faint yellow tint of the stationery, the kind my grandmother used to keep in her writing desk. I could almost smell the faint sweetness of old paper and dust, memories of letters tied with string. Why would he risk passing me a private message in front of everyone? My pulse drummed in my ears as I slipped the note into the inner pocket of my handbag, the same one Charles had given me on our 25th anniversary. I still remembered the feel of the leather when it was new, smooth as a promise, and how it had softened over the years, like a marriage that had weathered storms. Outside, the afternoon sun hit my face, warm but not comforting. I pulled the cardigan tighter around my shoulders and walked toward the car, aware of the weight of the note against my side. The vineyard, the shares, the home, all of it already felt complicated enough. But this secret, was something different. And if I had learned anything from years of marriage, of family dinners where people spoke in half-truths and sidelong glances, it was this. The things not said out loud are always the most dangerous. When you've lived long enough, you learn there are 2 kinds of friends, the ones who send flowers and the ones who tell you the truth. By the time I got home, the scent of roasted chicken and rosemary filled the kitchen, a comfort, though I hadn't had much appetite lately. I set my handbag on the counter, the note still tucked inside, and turned on the kettle. It was muscle memory, boiling water, spooning dried chamomile into the teapot, the steam curling upward like a sigh. I could have called anyone, but only one person came to mind. Margaret. We'd been friends since nursing school, and she had seen me through everything, from Charles's first big court win to the night he was hospitalized for the stroke. We had a ritual. She brewed peppermint tea, I brewed chamomile, and we talked until one of us fell asleep in an armchair. I dialed her number, the old rotary phone in the kitchen still clunky but dependable. She picked up on the second ring. Is it done? She asked, skipping any kind of greeting. That was Margaret. I told her about the clause in the will, about the vineyard I hadn't known existed, and finally, my voice dropping as though Elise could somehow hear through the walls, about the note. I read the words to her slowly, as if they might rearrange themselves if I spoke too quickly. She was silent for a moment, and I could hear her lighting one of those cinnamon-scented candles she kept in every room. If Charles set something aside just for you, it's because he knew Elisa's intentions, she said at last, her voice low but steady. Be careful, she's going to get desperate. I wrapped both hands around my teacup, the porcelain warm against my palms. You think she'll try something? I asked, though the answer was already buzzing in my chest. She already has, Margaret said bluntly. This is just the part you can see. Believe me, she's been laying tracks for years. And when someone's built their future on a certain outcome, they don't just walk away when the game changes. They push harder. Her words settled in me like the weight of wet wool. I thought back to Elisa's face at the reading, the sharp inhale, the rigid posture, the tapping foot. No, she wouldn't let this go. I glanced at the note again, still folded neatly on the counter beside my cup. Something you should see. I'd been around enough schemers in hospital board meetings and charity committees to know that something often meant everything. Margaret cleared her throat. When you call him tonight, keep your voice calm. Don't let him hear the hope in it. Hope makes people sloppy. You'll need to be careful until you know exactly what you're holding. Her advice was a familiar kind of balm, firm, unvarnished, but threaded with care. I sipped my tea, letting the soft bitterness roll over my tongue, and looked out the kitchen window. The late afternoon light made the backyard hydrangeas glow pale blue, the same color Charles had painted our bedroom when Elise was a baby. Outside, a breeze stirred the wind chimes, their gentle music drifting in through the screen door. It should have been peaceful, but all I could think of was Elisa's determined face, her heels clicking against marble, and the quiet promise in the attorney's eyes. The note was still there on the counter, patient as a cat, waiting for me to open the next door. And I knew I would, before the night was over. When you've been blindsided enough times, you learn the power of walking into a storm with your hair already tied back. I waited until the sun had dipped low enough to cast long shadows across the kitchen floor before I called the attorney. The note sat in front of me, its corners curling slightly from where my thumb had traced them over and over. The line crackled faintly when he picked up, his voice low, as if he were already expecting trouble. "Mrs. Parker," he said, "I didn't want to mention this in front of the others, but there's something Charles left you, personally. A sealed letter, addressed to you by name. He marked it to be opened only by my wife." For a moment, all I could hear was the faint ticking of the clock above the stove. I pressed my palm against the edge of the table, feeling the familiar grooves in the wood where Charles had once tapped his pen during late-night work sessions. "When can I see it?" I asked. My voice was steady, but my free hand had found the hem of my cardigan and was smoothing it in slow, deliberate strokes, an old reflex for keeping myself from speaking too quickly. "Tomorrow morning," he said. "First thing. I'd rather you come here before the office fills up." His tone carried an undercurrent of urgency that made the fine hairs on my arms rise. I hung up the phone and went to the bedroom. The scent of lavender sachets drifted from the open wardrobe, mixing with the faint smell of cedar from Charles's old suits. I chose my navy dress, the one I wore to every meeting where I needed to look composed but unshakable, and set it on the chair by the window. That night, I lay in bed listening to the soft hum of the ceiling fan, my fingertips running over the smooth beads of my rosary on the nightstand. I wasn't praying exactly, not in the way I used to when Charles was in the hospital. It was more like bracing. Because sealed letters are never about small matters. The morning arrived with the pale gold light of late summer streaming through the curtains. I made coffee but barely touched it, the bitter aroma filling the kitchen as I buttered a slice of toast and left it untouched on the plate. My cardigan went over my shoulders as naturally as breathing. The soft wool was both armor and anchor. The drive to the attorney's office was quiet, the hum of the tires on asphalt almost hypnotic. Outside the window, the vineyards rolled by in neat rows, leaves catching the light like green coins. I thought of Charles again, his steady hands pruning vines in a photo I'd once seen in a forgotten box. Maybe this vineyard wasn't just property. Maybe it was a message. By the time I pulled into the parking lot, my palms were dry, my heartbeat measured. I walked into the office, the scent of lemon cleaner sharp in the air. The receptionist looked up, startled, as if she hadn't expected me to arrive so early. "Mr. Bennett will be right with you," she said. I sat in one of the stiff leather chairs in the waiting area, smoothing my skirt, keeping my breathing even. Whatever was in that letter, it was meant for me alone. And I would finally know what Charles had seen coming. Some moments don't hit you all at once. They creep in like a cold draft under a closed door. The receptionist's polite smile faded when Mr. Bennett stepped into the hallway. His tie was crooked, his usually neat hair slightly mussed, and there was a grayness in his complexion that made me think of paper left too long in the sun. "Mrs. Parker," he said, his voice pitched lower than usual. "Come in." I followed him into his office, the faint scent of stale coffee and lemon cleaner hanging in the air. His desk, normally a careful display of order, was in disarray. Papers slightly askew, a pen cap missing, a drawer left half open. My eyes were drawn immediately to the top right corner of the desk, where an empty space sat like a pulled tooth. The letter was not there. "It was here last night," Bennett said, lowering himself into his chair as if the weight of the morning had already pressed him down. "Locked in the second drawer. I stayed late reviewing documents, and when I left, I checked, twice. I didn't sit." My hands tightened around the strap of my handbag until the leather creaked. "What happened?" He shook his head, rubbing at the bridge of his nose. "The cleaning staff reported something unusual. They saw your daughter, Elise, in the hallway after hours. She said she was looking for the restroom, but she was in the executive wing. No reason for her to be there." For a moment, the room seemed too small, the air too still. I could hear the faint ticking of the wall clock, each second stretching. My cardigan felt heavier over my shoulders, as though it had absorbed the weight of every silent warning Margaret had given me. "Are you certain?" I asked, though my stomach already knew the answer. "The staff recognized her," he said simply. "And there's no sign of forced entry." The betrayal should have felt like a blow, but instead it seeped in, cold and patient, settling into my bones. This wasn't the reckless act of someone panicked. This was Elise making her move. Bennett leaned forward. "I need you to understand, whatever was in that letter, your husband believed it was important enough to protect. This wasn't just sentiment, and if Elise has it." He let the rest hang in the air, the unspoken possibilities stretching between us. I thought of the vineyard, of the sudden way she'd lost her composure at the will reading. Of the years she'd spent cultivating her image, her calculated smiles, her gentle hand on Charles's shoulder while I fetched tea. I finally sat, resting my hands on my lap, fingers smoothing the edge of the cardigan. "If she took it," I said quietly, "then she's already read it." Bennett's eyes flickered, but he didn't contradict me. Outside the window, the morning sun caught on the chrome of passing cars, sending brief flashes of light across the room. I remembered Charles's voice in my mind, steady, deliberate, "Don't rush. Let her make the next mistake." And I knew she would. Sometimes winning doesn't feel like champagne, it feels like a single candle lit in a dark room. 2 days passed before I heard from Bennett again. They were long days, stretched thin by waiting, my mind running circles around what might have been in that letter. I kept the cardigan draped over the back of the kitchen chair like a talisman, brushing my fingers over its sleeve each time I passed by. On the morning of the second day, the phone rang. His voice carried the relief of a man who had been holding his breath. "I found something," he said. "Can you come in today?" When I arrived, the air in his office was different, lighter, but threaded with a current of anticipation. The blinds were drawn halfway, casting pale stripes of light across his desk. He gestured for me to sit, then slid a manila envelope toward me. "It's not the original," he said, "but I keep backups for certain documents." This was in my personal safe at home. The envelope was warm from his hands. My fingertips tingled as I opened it and pulled out a single sheet of paper, slightly creased, the handwriting instantly familiar. Charles's looping script, always a touch too dramatic, as if he were still signing love letters to me instead of grocery lists. I read the salutation first, "My dearest Anne." My throat tightened. Bennett leaned back, watching me but saying nothing. Outside, a car horn sounded faintly, breaking the heavy stillness for a moment. The letter was short, no more than a few lines, but every word carried weight. It spoke of trust, of foresight, and then a single instruction. "If Elise tries to contest your inheritance, open the safety deposit box at First National Bank, Box 107. I let the paper rest in my lap, smoothing its edge with my thumb. The scent of old ink, faint but there, rose from the page, and I thought of the night Charles must have written it, alone in his study, the desk lamp casting that soft golden light across his hair. Bennett's voice was calm when he spoke again. "Whatever's in that box, he wanted you to have it only if she forced your hand." I nodded slowly, folding the letter with care and sliding it back into the envelope. A copy was still a fragile thing, but it was enough. Enough to prove Elisa's break-in had failed. Enough to give me my next step. As I stood to leave, my eyes fell on the faint scratch marks around the drawer where the original had been kept. Elisa's impatience had left its mark here, in the same way her ambition had left marks all over my life, small, sharp, and hard to forget. Walking out into the afternoon sun, I pulled the cardigan tighter around me. The vineyard fields in the distance shimmered in the heat, looking almost unreal. But the letter in my bag was solid, real, and mine. And if Elise thought she'd stolen my only card, she was about to learn just how well Charles had played this game. Sometimes the truth waits in the quietest places, sealed behind steel and dust. The following morning, the air felt thick with the kind of heat that makes the sky look bleached. I left the house early, the cardigan draped over my arm despite the warmth, habit more than necessity. My handbag felt heavier than usual, the manila envelope inside giving it a strange, lopsided weight. First National Bank sat on the corner of Main and Willow, the same red brick building where Charles and I had opened our first joint account decades ago. The scent inside was exactly as I remembered, cool, filtered air tinged with the faint metallic note of coin and the dry paper smell of ledgers. A young clerk with bright lipstick escorted me to the vault, her heels clicking on the marble floor in a rhythm that reminded me of Elisa's sharp steps during the will reading. She handed me a key without ceremony. Box 107, Mrs. Parker. Take all the time you need. The vault door groaned as it swung open, the sound deep and old, like the belly of the earth opening. Inside, rows of identical boxes stretched before me. My key slid into the lock with a satisfying click. I drew a breath and turned it. The box was heavier than I expected. I carried it to the small private room the clerk indicated, its single table and chair bathed in sterile fluorescent light. Sitting down, I placed the cardigan on my lap, the wool a grounding weight. Inside, there were no jewels, no stacks of cash. Just a thick brown envelope marked in Charles's handwriting. For Anne, only if she needs it. My fingers hesitated on the flap. The paper felt warm from my touch, the seal crisp. I broke it carefully, the faint scent of old ink rising as I pulled out a neat stack of documents. At first, I didn't understand what I was looking at, bank statements, wire transfer receipts, spreadsheets. But then the name leapt out, Parker Family Holdings. And beneath it, Elisa's signature. The dates spanned months, all during Charles's illness, each transaction moving company funds into an offshore account registered under a name I didn't recognize. Charles had known. He'd kept records. And now those records were in my hands. I sat back, the hum of the fluorescent light loud in the small room. My pulse was steady, not racing, not yet. Because this wasn't just evidence. It was a weapon Elise had handed to me herself, the moment she broke into Bennett's office. The last page in the stack was an affidavit, signed and dated by Charles, verifying the transactions and affirming that they had been made without his authorization. His signature was bold, decisive, just as I remembered from the countless contracts we'd signed together. I slipped the documents back into the envelope and placed it in my handbag, the leather stretching slightly to accommodate it. My reflection in the polished steel wall looked different somehow, calmer, sharper, as if I had just stepped into a role I hadn't planned to play but was born for. When I stepped back into the lobby, the young clerk smiled politely, unaware of what I now carried. Outside, the heat pressed against my skin, but the air felt lighter. For the first time in weeks, I wasn't just reacting to Elisa's moves. I was ready to make my own. There's a particular stillness that comes when you realize the game has been fixed in your favor all along. The drive home from the bank felt different, as if the road itself had shifted under my tires. I kept one hand on the steering wheel and the other resting lightly on my handbag, as though someone might reach through the window to snatch it away. Inside that worn leather sat the kind of truth that could turn a reputation to dust. Back at the house, I didn't go to the kitchen or the bedroom. I went straight to Charles's study, the room I hadn't stepped into since the day we held his memorial. The air still smelled faintly of pipe tobacco and old books, that comforting, leathery scent that had clung to him even in his last days. Dust motes floated lazily in the slanting afternoon light, the same light that used to fall across his desk when he worked late into the evening. I set the cardigan over the back of his chair and placed my handbag on the desk. The documents came out slowly, each sheet smooth and cool beneath my fingertips. I spread them in a neat row, tracing the lines of numbers and signatures. Charles hadn't just known about Elisa's theft. He'd built a trail, one she couldn't wriggle out of. The dates, the account numbers, the verification stamps, it was all airtight. And the affidavit in his hand was the lock on the door she'd never be able to open. I sat back, my fingers drumming lightly on the edge of the desk, and thought about the months before he died. How he'd let Elise help with the finances. How he'd nodded patiently while she explained her plans for the company. How he'd insisted on double-checking every document, as though he were simply being thorough. But he wasn't just being thorough. He was watching her, testing her, and when she failed the test, he didn't shout or confront her, he laid his trap. The realization spread through me like warm tea after a winter walk. Charles had never doubted me. He'd never believed the lies Elise had whispered to relatives. He'd seen her for who she was, and he'd made sure that when the time came, I'd have exactly what I needed to protect myself, and the family legacy, from her. A soft smile tugged at my lips, the first genuine one in weeks. This wasn't about revenge for me. It was about finishing the work Charles had started. And maybe, just maybe, making sure Elise finally saw the cost of her own arrogance. Outside the window, the vineyard shimmered in the late sun, rows of green stretching into the horizon. I imagined Charles standing there, hands on his hips, surveying the work, knowing the harvest would come in its time. Well, the harvest was here. And Elise had no idea she was about to be standing in the middle of it. The best traps are the ones your opponent walks into thinking it's a red carpet. I didn't move on Elise right away. Patience is a weapon, too, and I'd learned from Charles that letting someone think they're still winning can make their fall twice as hard. The morning after my visit to the bank, I sat at the kitchen table with a fresh pot of chamomile tea, the cardigan wrapped snugly around my shoulders. The documents lay in front of me in a neat stack, weighted down by a small silver paperweight shaped like a grape cluster, a gift Charles had brought back from a vineyard tour years ago. Its smooth, cool surface under my palm felt like a reminder to keep my grip steady. I called Bennett first. "I have what was in the box," I said simply. His inhale was sharp, but he kept his tone even. "I'll arrange a meeting," he replied. "Just the immediate family, no one else. Let them think it's about clarifying the will." That was perfect. No drama, no advance warning for Elise to rehearse her denials. I knew her well enough to know that when cornered without preparation, her composure would crack, and she hated nothing more than a public crack in her image. Over the next 2 days, I went about my routine as if nothing had shifted. I pruned the roses in the garden, their petals scattering over my gloves in soft blush tones. I sorted Charles's old cufflinks into their box, inhaling the faint scent of cedar from the drawer. I even called Margaret, not to discuss the documents, but to ask if she wanted to join me for a walk by the vineyard later in the week. Keeping my life ordinary was part of the performance. But beneath it all, my mind was assembling the scene like a careful set designer. Elise would be there, expecting to push for adjustments to the inheritance. My son would be present, quiet but watchful. Bennett would have the documents in hand, ready for the moment the conversation turned. I pictured it like a chessboard, Elise advancing her queen without noticing the rook waiting in the corner. Every move I made now was deliberate, right down to the dress I would wear, deep burgundy, the color Charles once said made me look unshakable. On the evening before the meeting, I sat by the window, the vineyard stretching out in dusky rows under a lavender sky. My fingers traced the hem of the cardigan, soft and familiar, and I thought of Charles again, not in grief but in gratitude. He had built this for me, step by step, knowing I might one day need to stand on it without him. The papers waited in my handbag, resting quietly like a sealed promise. Elise believed she'd taken the only weapon from me. Tomorrow, she'd find out just how wrong she was. Some truths don't need to be shouted. They just need to be placed on the table where everyone can see them. The day of the meeting dawned overcast, the sky the color of tarnished silver. I chose my burgundy dress, the one with the structured shoulders, and looped a strand of pearls around my neck. The cardigan went over my arm, not my shoulders. Today, I wanted to look like someone who didn't need armor. Bennett's office was quiet when I arrived, the faint scent of lemon polish and brewing coffee mingling in the air. My son was already there, seated to the right of the conference table, his hands folded on the dark wood. He gave me a small nod, his eyes searching mine for reassurance. Elise arrived a few minutes later, heels clicking sharply on the tile, a silk scarf draped artfully around her neck. Her perfume, sharp and citrusy, announced her before she spoke. We exchanged the kind of smiles that have no warmth in them. Bennett cleared his throat once we were all seated. "Thank you for coming. I thought it best we have a private discussion to clarify certain aspects of the will." His tone was deliberately neutral, the kind a man uses when he's about to drop a weight into still water. Elise leaned back in her chair, crossing one leg over the other, her heel bouncing in a slow rhythm. "I think it's clear enough," she said lightly. "But if you need to explain something to Mother, by all means." The word, "mother," landed like a tack pushed into my palm, polite on the surface, pointed underneath. I smoothed the edge of the cardigan in my lap and said nothing. Bennett nodded slowly, as though indulging her. Then he reached into his briefcase and withdrew a thick brown envelope, the same one I had retrieved from the bank. He placed it in the center of the table, directly in front of Elise. "These," he said, "are records showing the transfer of company funds to an offshore account. All transactions occurred while Mr. Parker was alive and without his authorization. His affidavit is included." The bounce in Elise's heel stopped. She stared at the envelope as if it were a live wire. "Perhaps you'd like to review them now," Bennett continued, sliding the envelope toward her. She didn't touch it at first, but when she finally did, her hands were stiff, her manicured nails tapping once against the flap. The rustle of paper filled the room as she pulled the documents free. Her eyes flicked down each page, her jaw tightening with every line. My son leaned forward slightly, his gaze shifting between us. "Is this real?" he asked, his voice low. Bennett answered before Elise could open her mouth. "Verified by the bank, notarized by your father, and filed in my possession until Mrs. Parker was instructed to retrieve them." The silence that followed was thick enough to feel. Outside, a car passed, its tires hissing on wet pavement. Elise's eyes stayed on the papers, but I could see the faint tremor in her fingers. She had walked into the room thinking she was in control. Now, the ground beneath her was giving way, and she knew everyone could see it. When people are cornered, they either confess, or they claw. Elise's head snapped up from the papers, her cheeks flushed a deep rose that didn't match her lipstick. "This is absurd," she said, her voice sharp enough to slice through the quiet. "These could have been forged. Anyone could have faked my signature." Bennett didn't flinch. "The documents carry the bank's verification seals. Each transaction has a matching digital record, time-stamped and linked to your personal login credentials." His tone was steady, almost bored, like a teacher correcting an arrogant student. She turned to me then, her eyes blazing. "You did this, didn't you? You've been trying to turn everyone against me since the moment Dad got sick. You manipulated him." I smoothed the edge of the cardigan in my lap, letting the wool slip through my fingers in slow, measured strokes. "Elise," I said softly, "your father saw you clearly. You may not like what he saw, but it was his choice to act on it." Her laugh was brittle, hollow. "Oh, please. You think I'm going to sit here while you rewrite history? I took care of him. I was there every day." My son shifted in his seat. "I remember a lot of days when you weren't here," he said quietly. The words landed like a stone tossed into still water, sending ripples across the table. Elise ignored him, flipping one of the documents over as if she could erase what was printed there. "You have no idea the sacrifices I made for this family." Bennett leaned forward slightly, folding his hands on the table. "And yet, you transferred substantial company funds into an account outside U.S. jurisdiction, under a shell corporation registered in the Cayman Islands. You might want to think carefully before continuing to speak." The color in her cheeks deepened, and for a moment, I thought she might storm out. Instead, she slammed the papers back into the envelope and shoved it toward Bennett. "I'm not discussing this without my own attorney present." "That's your right," Bennett said smoothly, "but be aware, if you attempt to contest the will, these documents will become part of the public court record." Her eyes flicked to mine, a flash of something almost desperate breaking through the fury. But I didn't look away. I kept my expression calm, my voice even. "This isn't about punishing you, Elise. It's about protecting what your father built." He trusted me to do that. And I will. The room was silent except for the faint hum of the air vent. Elise's heel began tapping under the table again, faster now, the sound betraying her. She was calculating, weighing the cost of continuing this fight. I didn't need her to admit anything. Her silence was enough. There's a particular satisfaction in speaking the truth when the other person has run out of places to hide. I sat there for a moment after Elise shoved the envelope back toward Bennett, letting the silence stretch until even the ticking of the wall clock seemed loud. The cardigan lay across my lap, the soft wool warm against my palms, grounding me the way Charles's hand once did when he wanted me to keep steady. Finally, I pushed my chair back and stood. The legs scraped softly against the polished floor, the sound making Elise's head snap toward me. "You told me," I began, my voice low but carrying across the room, "that I would get nothing. That I was foolish to expect otherwise." I let the words hang there, watching the flicker in her eyes. "You tried to erase me from my own life. From the home I built. From the business your father and I started when all we had was his ambition and my nurse's salary." Her mouth opened, but I raised a hand, palm outward, a gesture Charles used when he'd had enough interruptions. "And all that time, you believed you were the clever one. But your father, he saw you. He saw the choices you made when you thought no one was watching. And he didn't just see, he planned for it." The muscles in her jaw tightened, but she didn't speak. My son sat very still, his gaze fixed on me. "Now," I continued, "everyone here sees you, too. Not the polished version you present at fundraisers, not the dutiful daughter act you play when the right people are looking. The real you. The one who takes what isn't hers and then calls it sacrifice." I could feel the room leaning toward me, the weight of every unspoken word finally settling into place. My voice didn't shake, though my heart was thudding against my ribs. "This is the end of it, Elise. You will not contest the will. You will not touch the company. And you will not, under any circumstances, undermine me again. Because if you do," I glanced at the envelope still on the table, "every detail of what you've done will be laid bare for the world to see." The only sound was the faint hum of the air conditioner and the muffled rush of cars outside. Elise's eyes darted toward my son, perhaps hoping for an ally. But his expression was unreadable, his hands still folded neatly on the table. I reached for my cardigan, draped it over my arm, and straightened my pearls. "Your father trusted me to protect what he built," I said, softer now but no less firm. "And I intend to honor that trust. Even if it means protecting it from you." Without waiting for a response, I turned toward the door. Bennett rose slightly from his seat as I passed, giving me a small nod, acknowledgement, not pity. As I stepped into the hallway, the muted scent of lemon polish met me again. I breathed it in, letting the calm settle over me. Behind me, I could hear Elise's voice starting up again, sharper now, but it no longer mattered. I had said what needed to be said. And more importantly, she knew I meant every word. Some endings are loud. Others are just the slow fading of footsteps you no longer bother to follow. In the days after that meeting, Elise vanished from family life as though she'd been erased with a single, deliberate stroke. She didn't call, didn't email, and, perhaps most telling, didn't show up to Sunday dinner at my son's house. Word travels fast in our circles, and I knew whispers about her dispute with the will had already begun to circulate. Whispers, once they leave your control, have a way of multiplying. Her absence was not a relief exactly, but it was a stillness. The kind of stillness that settles over the vineyard on an early morning, when the dew clings to each leaf and the air smells faintly of wet earth and promise. The company, freed from her constant interference, began to find its rhythm again. The managers Charles had trusted, honest, seasoned men and women who valued legacy over quick profit, took up the reins with quiet competence. I visited the office once a week, my presence both symbolic and practical. The leather chairs still smelled faintly of Charles's cologne, and I'd find myself tracing the edge of the conference table, remembering our first big client meeting decades ago. The vineyard, too, began to flourish under new management. I walked the rows in the late afternoons, the sun warming my shoulders, the cardigan draped loosely over one arm. The grapes hung heavy on the vines, their skins almost translucent in the light. I would pause to touch them gently, their cool firmness a reminder of how much care it takes to turn raw potential into something lasting. Margaret came by often, sometimes bringing fresh bread, sometimes just herself and that cinnamon-scented candle she insisted made any room more forgiving. We'd sit on the porch swing, sipping tea as the wind chimes tinkled softly, and she'd ask, not without a glint in her eye, if I'd heard from Elise. No, I'd say, and leave it at that. Because the truth was, I didn't need to. Elise's silence was its own answer. My son and I grew closer in those months, the tension that had once sat between us easing away. He began bringing his children to the vineyard on weekends, letting them run between the rows while we talked business and shared memories of Charles. One afternoon, as the sun dipped low, he told me quietly, "Dad would have been proud of how you handled her." I didn't reply, just rested my hand on his, the gesture saying what words couldn't. The cardigan, once a shield, began to feel more like a keepsake. I still wore it on cool evenings, but not because I needed its comfort to stand tall. Now, it was simply a thread that tied me to the past without binding me there. Life had not returned to what it was before Charles passed, how could it, but it had found a new balance. One built on truth, on loyalty, and on the unshakable certainty that the foundation we'd laid together could withstand even the sharpest cracks. And in that quiet, I realized something. I didn't have to chase justice. Sometimes, it simply settles around you like the dusk over the vineyard, soft, inevitable, and complete. In the end, the truest victories are the quiet ones, measured not in applause, but in peace. These days, my evenings belong to the porch. I take my tea out just as the sun begins to sink behind the vineyard, its gold spilling over the rows like warm honey. The air is different at that hour, cooler, carrying the faint sweetness of ripening grapes and the earthy undertone of the soil that has held us steady all these years. I sit in the old wicker chair, the cardigan draped over my shoulders, and listen to the steady hum of crickets tuning up for the night. Some evenings, the grandchildren run across the yard, their laughter threading through the rustle of the vines. Other nights, it's just me, the wind chimes, and the slow unfolding of twilight. From here, I can see the edges of what Charles left me, not just the land, the business, or the shares, but the invisible architecture of trust. He had built it brick by brick, knowing there might come a day when I'd need its shelter. The vineyard was never simply an investment. It was a message. I saw you. I trusted you. I chose you. Elise's name rarely comes up anymore. When it does, it's usually in the quiet, careful way people speak of someone who's stepped outside the circle. I don't chase updates. Whatever she's doing now, she's doing it without my interference, and without access to the things she once believed she could take. I've learned that betrayal has its own clock. It ticks away silently, counting down to the moment it reveals itself. And when it does, you don't have to shout. You don't have to throw stones. You simply have to be ready. Charles gave me that readiness. He gave me the tools to hold my place without rage, without spectacle. The kind of justice that doesn't leave scorch marks, but leaves no doubt. Sometimes, when the light fades just right, I imagine him walking through the rows, his hands brushing the vines, his eyes on the horizon. I like to think he'd look toward the porch, see me sitting there with my tea, and know he'd done exactly what needed to be done. The cardigan's weight is warm and familiar against my shoulders, but it's not armor anymore. It's a reminder. Love isn't just the promises you make, it's the protections you leave behind. And dignity? Dignity is knowing that when the world gave you the choice between silence and fury, you chose silence, and still won.